Episode 3 Poseidon the Devourer. For the sea was raised by an earthquake, and it submerged Aliki, and also the temple of the Heliconian Poseidon, whom the Ionians worship even to this day. Strabo, Geographica, Book 8, Chapter 7, Section 2. Despite Aliki's continuous existence over several thousand years in significance, as discussed in the prior episode, it was repeatedly destroyed by seismic activity over its long history. These repeated events left lasting impressions upon both the inhabitants of Aliki as well as the renowned philosophers, historians, and poets of the wider Greco-Roman world. Earthquakes were the plague of Aliki. From the time of her founding in the early Bronze Age, the city-state experienced no less than 6 catastrophic earthquakes in antiquity alone, with 2 more occurring in the centuries since. It is safe to say that Aliki sits on a particularly seismic area. To the south, the clashing of the gargantuan Eurasian and African plates were supplemented by the Aliki and Chaeronea faults running underneath the city and the several fault lines running throughout the Gulf of Corinth which Aliki sat beside. This confluence of rifts and fault lines created unique geological conditions, which made the site of Aliki at once a promising and economically critical location for the ancient Mediterranean, while also cementing the fate of the city to be repeatedly annihilated by unseen forces. For the ancients, the world was an interconnected web of deities, omens, and primordial forces which governed the world. These forces and deities often exacted cruel revenge upon the people living on the mortal plane, with distinct local and regional traditions dominating a person's understanding of the world and those punishments. For the people of Aliki, there was a natural choice of deity when looking back upon their seismic history. Poseidon had become the most frequently mentioned of the Olympian pantheon during what has become known as the earthquake storms of the Late Bronze Age, with the continual destruction of cities being associated with the god. For the Alikians, who themselves likely experienced a catastrophic earthquake in both the early and late Bronze Age, a deep and lasting connection between their location and the god must have been felt. The system of polis religion, or the adherence of an entire city-state to one certain religious cult, is an important one to understand in the context of Aliki. Cults in ancient Greece are quite different from what we think of today. These cults were not like those of Jonestown or Scientology. Instead, they were localized, unique, and often regionally tailored to environmental conditions, thus forming the basis of social and ritual activity. This is not to say that Alikians living under the cult of Poseidon would be restricted from appealing to any other god, but instead that the basic fundamentals of their religious practice would revolve around that cult and its rituals. For the Alikians, then, a localized form of Poseidon worship would form the basis of their social and religious activity, stemming from the frequency of seismic events of the region. The development of the cult of Poseidon Helikonios, named after Aliki itself, is an interesting one. Homer references the cult in the Iliad, noting that Hera, wife to Zeus, calls upon Poseidon to show mercy for the Greeks, quote, "who bring you many a welcome offering to Aliki and Aigai." Due to the time of Homer's writing, this line firmly places the cult as far back as the 9th century BCE, but likely much earlier, as the Iliad is meant to depict the Greek world at the time of the Bronze Age. This line also tells us that Aliki was a pilgrimage site for the Greeks, which would make it both an important spiritual place, but also a cosmopolitan center for the Greek world. The city became an even greater place of pilgrimage in the years following the Ionian migration, as a part of the Pan-Ionia festival, which was celebrated amongst all Ionians. Even when written about in the 2nd century CE, Pausanias notes in his description of Greece that he comes across where there, quote, used to be situated a city Aliki, where the Ionians had a very holy sanctuary of Heliconian Poseidon. Their worship of Heliconian Poseidon has remained, even after their expulsion by the Achaeans to the coasts of Asia. At Miletus too, on the way to the spring Byblis, there is before the city an altar of Heliconian Poseidon, and in Teos likewise the Heliconian has a precinct and an altar, well worth seeing. Interestingly, this diasporic connection would become seen as a key reason for Aliki's famous destruction in the year 373 BCE. In both Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, an incident is noted as occurring just prior to the devastating earthquake in Aliki. The diasporic Ionians sought to reestablish a new Pan-Ionia celebration within the region of Ionia itself, and after some counsel by the famed oracle at Delphi, appealed to those at Aliki to make a sacrifice and bring home copies of the ancestral altars at Aliki. Here, ethnic, cultural, or religious tensions snapped between those who had remained at Aliki and those who had departed centuries prior. After the Ionians made their sacrifice, the Alikians defiled the sacrificial remains and kidnapped the Ionian representatives, thus committing sacrilege against Poseidon in a presumed act of anger or fear. Both Diodorus Siculus and Strabo cite this event as the reason for Aliki's destruction in 373 BCE, less than a year after the sacrilege was committed, and as proof of Poseidon's wrath and control over the earth and sea. It is hard to ascertain from the sources alone just how destructive the 373 BCE earthquake was, but many writers saw the destruction as complete. Pausanias, for example, writes in the 2nd century CE that, quote, "The sea flooded a great part of the land, and covered up the whole of Aliki all round. Moreover, the tide was so deep in the grove of Poseidon that only the tops of the trees remained visible." What with the sudden earthquake and the invasion of the sea that accompanied it, the tidal wave swallowed up Aliki and every man in it. In addition to the historical sources, the archaeology of the region has come to show some of the annihilation wrought upon the land. Recent evidence has brought to light not only the classically understood earthquake and tsunami event, but a massive mud flow from the foothills above, sweeping in at the same time. This triple threat is proposed to have combined with subsidence, or submergence of the city, of roughly 3 meters, or close to 10 feet, as well as ground liquefaction in the land closest to the fault line. Aliki's population had peaked prior to the 373 BCE quake at around 30,000, and now the villages which make up the same region has less than 2,000 inhabitants. Despite this devastation wrought by their god, both diasporic Ionians and colonizing Alikians celebrated the cult abroad. In Sybaris and her daughter colonies, coinage was minted in his name and image even after the destruction and refoundation of the colony in the 5th century BCE. In Ionia, altars and sanctuaries were dedicated to the cult alongside coinage, and the same was found in the Black Sea, with an entire temple dedicated to Heliconian Poseidon in Sinope. For many prominent cities across the Greek world, Poseidon Heliconius was not simply another deity, but often a principal one, and a living reminder of what could occur if one were to transgress against the gods. Poseidon came to be the sign of not only Aliki, but much of the Ionian diaspora and later Achaean colonies. The primeval Earthshaker god both consumed the city while also breathing life into it. However, in this, Aliki is far from alone. Instead, the same can be seen amongst the many poleis of ancient Greece, from Delphi to Athens and beyond. For a population so deeply superstitious, every tremor from below, storm from above, and famine and plague on the mortal plane was yet another ancient god materializing themselves in an age where they could no longer freely walk amongst humankind.